The story begins with a diagnosis of a fading superpower. We are witnessing the unraveling of dominance not because a rival suddenly became invincible, but because the hegemon fell victim to its own nostalgia. The United States, accustomed to absolute authority, made a fatal strategic error. It confused its tools of power with power itself. Washington reached for its favorite hammer, sanctions and coercion, believing these instruments could compensate for a decaying industrial base. This was an anatomy of miscalculation, where leaders overestimated their ability to punish and drastically underestimated a rival's capacity to endure pain and adapt. They tried to project strength abroad while ignoring the crumbling pillars of economic reality at home. To understand the magnitude of this gamble, we must understand the machinery that upheld the American century. For decades, U.S. hegemony rested on two unparalleled pillars: technological supremacy and financial dominance. The U.S. didn't just participate in the global market, it owned the choke points. It controlled the intellectual property of chip design, NVIDIA, Qualcomm, and the manufacturing tools, ASML, effectively holding the off switch for the global digital economy. This was reinforced by the US dollar and the SWIFT system, which allowed Washington to dictate the rules of global commerce. For a long time, this architecture seemed invincible. In October 2022, the US decided to pull the trigger. In an unprecedented move, Washington launched the most sweeping export controls in history, effectively weaponizing the global supply chain against China. The objective was explicit and ruthless: to choke off Beijing's access to advanced computing, freeze its technological progression in time, and lock in U.S. dominance for another decade. This was not merely a trade dispute. It was an attempt to kneecap the industrial rise of a peer competitor by cutting the digital arteries that connected it to the world. However, this checkmate move was built on four deeply flawed assumptions. First, the U.S. assumed allied obedience, that nations like the Netherlands and South Korea would permanently subordinate their own economic survival to American security interests. Second, it assumed global dependency, that the world had no alternative to the U.S. order. Most dangerously, it relied on Chinese incapacity, a belief that state-led investment could never replicate the magic of Western innovation. Finally, Washington overestimated its own domestic resilience, believing it could re-industrialize at home while tearing apart the global trade networks it relied upon. Reality struck back. Coercion did not cause a collapse. It galvanized a transformation. By cutting off access to Western tech, the U.S. created the one thing China needed most: a unified national urgency to innovate. The sanctions forced Beijing to pour resources into the National IC Industry Development Fund and eliminate supply chain vulnerabilities. The turning point arrived in 2023 with the appearance of a domestically built 7nm class chip. While not the most advanced in the world, it demonstrated a crucial strategic fact: China had crossed the threshold from dependency to autonomy. The logic of coercion collapses once a rival realizes that good enough is all a great power needs to survive. The consequences of this failed containment rippled outward. The rest of the world watched the U.S. weaponize the dollar and the supply chain and drew a frightening conclusion. Dependence on Washington had become a strategic liability. This sparked a quiet but massive exodus. The BRICS Plus nations accelerated efforts to settle trade in local currencies. Saudi Arabia moved toward yuan-settled energy deals, cracking the monopoly of the petrodollar. Even European allies began whispering about strategic autonomy, while the global South embraced multipolarity, not out of ideology, but out of self-preservation. As the U.S. overextended itself abroad, the rot in the foundation began to show. The domestic economy, the engine of all military power, began to sputter. The M2 money supply contracted for the first time since the Great Depression, signaling deep financial strain. Simultaneously, the cost of servicing federal debt exploded, crowding out the very investments needed to compete with China. The much-touted CHIPS Act struggled against labor shortages and regulatory hurdles, revealing a hollowed-out industrial base that could not easily be rebuilt. The system entered a panic phase, characterized by fragile treasury markets and failing regional banks, a clear signal that the financial core could no longer support the weight of imperial ambition. The U.S. is now trapped in a self-reinforcing cycle of overextension. It begins with geopolitical overreach, demanding compliance the world is no longer willing to give. This leads to an erosion of global trust as partners hedge against American unpredictability. This exposes internal fragility, showing the limits of U.S. debt and industry. And finally, as real leverage diminishes, the state becomes desperate, reaching for even more coercive demands, which only accelerates the decline. The story concludes with a return to realism. The tragedy of this era is that the U.S. mistook temporary compliance for permanent obedience. It forgot the iron law of history. You cannot project power from a fractured foundation. A multipolar order has emerged not because the U.S. was defeated on a battlefield, but because it failed to recognize that the world had changed. The map has been redrawn, and the webs of commerce and technology are rerouting around the old center. The reckoning is the painful acceptance that coercion without capacity is not a strategy. It is an accelerator of decline. All credit for this content is from USA versus China, the technology battle of the century.